900 feet beyond the deepest survey point in the system, Kevin's dive light caught a guideline, taut, tied off, and leading deeper into the black. No one had ever been this far. The knot was a double figure eight, a signature his instructor Frank taught only a handful of divers. Frank died in a cave collapse 6 years ago. Three true accounts from a body recovery diver in Florida's flooded caves. The third story is why Kevin now ties every line with that same knot. Kevin Vance has spent the last 19 years volunteering for a job nobody wants. When a diver goes missing in Florida's flooded cave systems, the sheriff's department doesn't call a rescue team. They call Kevin. By then, the diver is already dead. His job is to bring the body home. These caves have claimed over 160 divers since the 60s. Miles of twisting limestone, zero visibility, and one wrong turn means you never find your way out. Kevin knows the deadliest systems better than any living diver, but 3 recoveries forced him to question what else is down there. The first one began with a phone call from a deputy in Marietta. Jackson County Sheriff's Office got the call on a Tuesday morning. A 26-year-old diver named Mark Renshaw hadn't surfaced from a system known locally as the Hole in the Wall. His girlfriend was waiting at the truck. She'd been sitting there for 4 hours. When Kevin pulled into the gravel lot, the deputies had already taped off the entrance. The sun was climbing, thick Florida heat pressing down, but everyone standing around the sinkhole looked cold. They always do, because they know what a missing diver means. There's no rescue here, only recovery. Kevin suited up in silence. Twin steel tanks, redundant regulators, 3 backup lights, 2 cutting tools, a reel with over 3,000 feet of line. Everything checked, then checked again. In technical cave diving, the rule of thirds is sacred. You use 1/3 of your gas to go in, 1/3 to come out, and 1/3 as a reserve for when things go wrong. Kevin planned his penetration for 1,200 feet. The system had been surveyed to 1,800, but a missing diver usually panics, bolts, kicks up silt, and gets lost in zero visibility. You don't need to go deep. You just need to follow their mistakes. He submerged, the water a cool 72 degrees, crystal clear for the first 200 feet. Limestone walls pale and smooth, like the throat of some enormous sleeping creature. His dive light cut through the passage, revealing the permanent guideline tied off at intervals by the original survey team. Kevin clipped his reel to the line and began the swim. The passage narrowed, then dropped into a steep vertical fissure. At 400 feet of penetration, he saw the first sign of trouble: silt. Fine brown particles hanging motionless in the beam of his light like suspended smoke. The visibility went from 40 feet to 5 in the span of a breath. This is what kills them. They lose the line, they panic, they thrash. The silt becomes an impenetrable cloud and they never find their way out. Kevin followed the permanent guideline by touch, pulling himself hand over hand through the murk. The line was slack in places, meaning the diver had tugged at it, likely in desperation. He found a drop dive light at 600 feet. The housing was cracked, the bulb dead. Then a fin. One single black dive fin wedged between 2 rocks, the strap still buckled. No sign of the body yet. At 900 feet, the passage opened into a small chamber. Kevin's light swept across the ceiling and caught a shape suspended in the water column. Mark Renshaw. His buoyancy compensator had failed to inflate, so he sank after he stopped breathing. His regulator was out of his mouth, dangling beneath him. The expression on his face was one Kevin had seen too many times. Not fear, confusion, like someone trying to remember something important in the moment the world went dark. Kevin secured the body and began the long, slow extraction. The swim out took 40 minutes, reeling in his guideline as he went, checking his gas levels constantly. When he broke the surface, the deputies helped haul Mark onto the bank. His girlfriend collapsed. Kevin peeled off his mask, looked at the dive computer strapped to the dead man's wrist, and froze. The readout showed maximum depth, 304 feet. That was impossible. The chamber he found the body in was 160 feet at the deepest. There was no way to go deeper from there. No side passages, no fissures. He'd checked. He'd been in that system a dozen times. And yet the computer showed Mark Renshaw had found a way down into 30 additional feet of water that didn't exist. Kevin handed the computer to the lead deputy without a word. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but he would. That night back at his workshop, he pulled up the survey map of hole in the wall. The passage Kevin knew ended at 1,800 feet, a terminal collapse of boulders where the cave ceiling had fallen in. No one had ever gone past it. No one could. The map was definitive. Kevin stared at it for an hour, then finally wrote a single note in the margin. Check for secondary passage at the collapse. Mark's computer doesn't lie. The dive that made him write that note would change everything. But Mark Renshaw wasn't the diver who would break Kevin's understanding of what lives beneath the limestone. That came a year later in a system called Twin Springs, 900 feet past the end of the map. The call came in late September. Twin Springs is a system on private land outside High Springs. 2 sinkhole entrances connected by a labyrinth of low bedding plains and vertical chimneys. Surveyed to 2,400 feet of penetration. Deep, cold, and prone to silt out faster than almost any cave in the district. A 34-year-old cave instructor named David Morrow had entered the water at 8 in the morning for what his logbook described as a solo exploration push. When his wife called the sheriff at 4 that afternoon, he'd been missing for 8 hours. The math was brutal. Even with double tanks, his gas would have run out by noon. Kevin arrived as the sun was setting. He knew David. Not well, but the cave community in Florida is small. You train together, you share survey data, you run into each other at fill stations. David was experienced, certified to full cave, trimix, stage diving. He had no business getting lost. But Kevin had learned long ago that experience means nothing when the cave decides otherwise. Panic is a physiological event, not a character flaw. In zero visibility, with your regulator scraping the ceiling and your reel tangled, the most disciplined mind in the world can unravel in seconds. He briefed the deputies on what to expect. The recovery would be deep, likely beyond recreational limits. If David had pushed past the survey terminus, the body could be anywhere in uncharted passage. Kevin set his turn pressure at 3,000 psi. He would follow the main guideline to the end, search the terminal chamber, and exit. No heroics, just bring David home. The descent through the entrance sinkhole was eerily calm. Twin Springs has a permanent halocline at 80 feet, a swirling boundary layer where fresh water meets salt water, and it distorts the light like rippled glass. Kevin passed through it and entered the main cavern. The permanent line was visible, a white nylon thread running into the darkness. He clipped his reel and started the swim. 600 feet in, he found the first sign. A stage bottle, intact and full, clipped to the line at a tie-off. Divers leave stage bottles as gas caches for deep penetrations. This one was marked with David's initials in silver Sharpie. Kevin checked the pressure gauge. 3,000 psi, untouched. David had dropped it here intending to pick it up on the exit. He never made it back. Kevin continued. The passage narrowed to a tight restriction, a sideways squeeze where the ceiling and floor pressed together like a closing jaw. He slipped through sideways, tanks scraping, and emerged into a larger tunnel. The permanent line ended 300 feet later, tied off around a boulder with a standard Bali knot. This was the survey terminus. Beyond it, the cave had never been mapped. David would have known this. He would have had to lay his own line from here. And then Kevin's light caught it. Beyond the terminal tie-off, running straight into the uncharted black, was a guideline, not David's, not survey line. This one was modern braided nylon, slightly thinner than the permanent line, clean and new. It was tied off to the same boulder with a knot Kevin recognized immediately. A double figure eight, dressed and cinched with a specific extra loop through the standing end. A variation that was never taught in any agency curriculum. A variation Kevin had only ever seen one person tie, Frank Mosley. Kevin felt the cold move from the water into his chest. Frank Mosley was his instructor, the man who had certified him in cave diving 16 years ago. Frank was relentless about knots. He believed the double figure eight was the only tie-off a diver ever needed, and he'd modified it, added that extra loop, then drilled it into every student he ever taught. Kevin could tie it in his sleep. He could recognize it at a glance. And Frank Mosley drowned in 2019 in a cave system 40 miles from here. Kevin had attended his memorial. He had carried the casket. He checked the line. It was taut. It ran deeper into the cave, disappearing into the darkness past the limits of his light. Kevin hovered there, breathing, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The knot was fresh. The nylon showed no signs of silt accumulation, no biofilm, no degradation. This line had been tied recently. Within weeks, maybe days, he made a decision that went against every safety protocol he had ever followed. He unclipped from the permanent line and clipped into the unknown guideline. Then he swam. The passage descended at a 30-degree angle, widening into a massive chamber that had never been documented. Kevin's light disappeared into the void, illuminating nothing but water and rock formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. He checked his depth gauge. 210 feet. His gas consumption was elevated, the adrenaline pushing his breathing rate higher than it should be. He forced himself to slow down, to control his heart rate, to think like a diver and not a man chasing a ghost. At 900 feet of penetration from the survey terminus, he found another tie-off. Same knot, double figure eight with the extra loop. The line continued past it, running further into the system. Kevin stopped. His pressure gauge read 2,000 psi. He was at his turn point, the third of his gas that belonged to the exit. If he continued, he would be eating into his reserve. The rule of thirds was not negotiable. It was the difference between surviving and becoming another body for someone else to recover. He photographed the tie-off. 3 clear shots, documenting the knot, the line, the depth. Then he turned his dive. The swim out was 45 minutes of controlled ascent through darkness. He found David Morrow's body at the 1,300-foot mark, tangled in his own real line at the restriction. David had panicked, tried to force his way through the squeeze without unclipping, and the line had wrapped around his tank valve. He'd exhausted his gas trying to free himself. Kevin cut the entanglement, secured David to his harness, and brought him to the surface. It was standard recovery work, the kind of tragedy Kevin had seen a dozen times. But his mind was not on the body he was towing. It was on the line, the knot, the 900 feet of unexplored passage that someone had mapped without anyone knowing. Back on the surface, the standard debrief with the deputies took 30 minutes. Kevin handed over David's dive computer, his logbook, the photographs from the recovery. He did not mention the guideline, not yet. He needed to process it first. He drove home in silence, the photographs burning a hole in his gear bag. That night, he sat in his workshop surrounded by survey maps. Twin Springs had been fully mapped in 2011 by the Florida Speleological Society. The survey team had pushed to 2,400 feet and certified the cave as terminal, meaning no further passage existed. Kevin had been on that survey. He had personally placed the baleen knot at the terminus. There was no continuation. There was no way anyone could have gone deeper without blasting through solid limestone. And yet the photographs existed, clear as day. Modern line tied to the same boulder with a knot that belonged to a dead man. He called the survey team leader, a geologist named Lisa Tran, who had spent 20 years studying Florida's karst hydrology. He sent her the photographs without explanation. She called back within 15 minutes. Her voice was shaking. "Kevin, where did you take these?" "In Twin Springs, past the terminus, about 900 feet. There's no passage there." "We did sonar. We did dye traces. That cave ends. It hits an impermeable caprock." "I know, but I clipped into that line. I swam it. It's real." Silence on the line. Then Lisa said the words Kevin had been dreading. "The knot, that's Frank's knot. I watched him teach it at a workshop in 2017. He said he only ever taught it to 6 divers, not including his open water students." "Kevin, I'm looking at Frank's obituary right now. He died March 4th, 2019. You were at the funeral. I was at the funeral." "I know. So who the hell is tying his knots 900 feet past the end of a surveyed cave?" The question hung in the air. Neither of them had an answer. Lisa offered to assemble a team to run a formal survey of the new passage to document everything. Kevin agreed. They planned the dive for the following weekend. 4 divers, full stage gas, survey equipment, high-definition cameras. Whatever was down there, they would map it. They would find out who had laid that line. But the dive never happened. 2 days before they were scheduled to enter the water, a diver went missing in Twin Springs. Not an explorer, not a surveyor. a 42-year-old tourist named Cameron Holt, who had driven down from Georgia with a single tank and no cave certification. He had entered the water at dawn alone, without telling anyone where he was going. His rental car was found in the parking lot with a map of the area on the passenger seat. A map with a handwritten X marked exactly at the location of the unmarked passage Kevin had discovered. Kevin got the call from the sheriff's office at 6 in the morning. They asked if he could handle the recovery. He said yes. But as he loaded his gear into the truck, he felt something he hadn't felt in 19 years of this work. Fear. Not of the cave, not of the depth. Fear of what he was going to find when he followed that ghost line all the way to its end. Because Cameron Holt didn't know about the passage. No one did, and yet someone had shown him exactly where to go. Kevin pulled into the Twin Springs lot at first light. 2 sheriff's cruisers, an ambulance idling with its back doors open, and a small crowd of volunteers from the local dive community standing around holding coffee cups they weren't drinking. Cameron Holt's rental sedan sat in the gravel, driver's side door still open, as if he'd scrambled out in a hurry. The map was still on the passenger seat. The X was drawn in red ink, a precise dot on the northeast corner of the sinkhole. Kevin stared at it for a long moment. The location was not marked on any public map. It was survey data known only to a handful of people, and yet a tourist from Georgia had driven directly to it. He briefed the deputies with the bare minimum. Cameron Holt was uncertified, untrained, diving a single aluminum 80 tank, with no guideline reel, no backup lights, and no redundant gas. He had been missing for nearly 18 hours now. The recovery was a formality. Everyone at the scene knew what that meant. Kevin suited up, his movements mechanical, the weight of the previous week pressing on his shoulders. He strapped on 4 stage bottles this time, enough gas to push well past the terminus if he needed to. He had no intention of turning back until he found exactly what waited at the end of that ghost line. The surface water was glassy and green, the morning sun filtering through the cypress trees. Kevin submerged and dropped into the halocline, the familiar shimmer giving way to cool darkness. He followed the main line past the restriction where David Morrow had died, past the untouched stage bottle still clipped at 600 feet, and reached the survey terminus. The boulder, the Bali knot. And there, tied to the same rock, the thinner braided nylon line running into the void. He clipped his primary reel to the survey line as a safety, then clipped a secondary reel to the ghost line and began the swim, 900 feet into uncharted passage. The cave opened into the massive chamber he had photographed a week earlier. The line continued, taut and clean, tied off at regular intervals with that same double figure eight. Kevin's depth gauge ticked past 200 feet. The water was cold, 49 degrees, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even through a dry suit. He checked his gas and kept going. The chamber narrowed into a horizontal passage, smooth-walled like a tunnel carved by some ancient underground river. At 1,400 feet of penetration from the terminus, the line ended. A final tie-off around a limestone column, the knot dressed perfectly. And clipped to the line, swaying gently in the current, was a stage bottle. It was not one of Kevin's. It was not a survey bottle. It was an 80 cubic foot aluminum cylinder painted black with no markings, no initials, no date. The pressure gauge read 100 psi, nearly empty, but it had been full once. Someone had breathed it. Kevin's light swept the chamber. The floor was silt undisturbed. The ceiling was smooth. And then he saw the shape. A figure curled against the far wall, legs tucked up, arms wrapped around his chest. The posture of a man freezing to death. But the figure moved. Kevin's heart slammed against his ribs. The man raised his head. His mask was fogged, his regulator was still in his mouth, and he was breathing from a second stage connected to the black stage bottle. Kevin crossed the chamber in 3 kicks. He grabbed the man's harness, checked his eyes, watched for signs of panic. The eyes were wide, aware, tracking Kevin's movements. The man was alive. 18 hours missing, a single tank long since exhausted, and he was alive. Kevin passed his backup regulator to the man, then conducted the fastest exit of his life. When they broke the surface, the deputies standing at the water's edge froze in disbelief. The diver they had come to recover was coughing, shivering, and very much conscious. The paramedics lifted Cameron Holt onto a stretcher, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and started oxygen. Kevin peeled off his gear, his mind racing, and knelt beside the man he had fully expected to be carrying out in a body bag. Cameron's lips were blue, his voice a dry rasp. He told Kevin he remembered running out of air. He'd been hopelessly lost, sucking the last breaths from a tank that had nothing left, the darkness closing in. He'd accepted he was going to die. And then through the black water, a light appeared. A diver swam toward him, calm and unhurried, his movements smooth as glass. He held a stage bottle in his hand, clipped it to the line, gestured for Cameron to breathe from the regulator, and then pointed deeper into the cave. Cameron shook his head, too weak to follow, but the diver simply hovered there for a moment, as if appraising him, and then turned and swam back the way he had come. The light disappeared into the stone. Kevin asked what the diver looked like. Cameron closed his eyes, trying to recall. Older guy, he said, gray hair cut short, a weathered face like someone who'd spent decades in the sun. Black dry suit, twin tanks, a reel clipped to his harness with a thin white line. And he tied his line to the rock before he left, a knot. Cameron made a gesture with his fingers, twisting his hands to mimic what he'd seen. It was a double figure eight with an extra loop. Kevin felt the world tilt. He asked the question anyway, the one he already knew the answer to. Did the diver say anything? Cameron nodded weakly. One word. He said my name. And then he pointed at the stage bottle. Like he knew I'd need it, like he'd been waiting. Kevin stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the sinkhole, stared into the green water, and saw nothing but his own reflection. Frank Mosley had been dead for 6 years. His body was recovered from a cave 40 miles away. Kevin had identified the remains himself, and yet a man who should not exist had just guided a dying tourist to a staged bottle that no one in the community knew was there. The deputies took Cameron to the hospital. Kevin stayed at the sinkhole for another hour, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, turning the photographs over in his mind. The ghost line, the impossible passage, the knot that belonged to a dead man and now a survivor who described a rescuer wearing Frank's face. He thought about the 6 divers Frank had taught the knot to. He was one of them. The others were all alive, accounted for, and none of them had been diving Twin Springs. None of them had the skills to extend a survey line 900 feet past a caprock without anyone noticing. The most logical explanation was that someone was copying Frank's methods, perhaps a former student he didn't know about. But that didn't explain the staged bottle, or the fact that the rescuer had known Cameron's name. The following week, Lake City Medical Center discharged Cameron Holt into the care of his family. Kevin visited him once in a sterile hospital room smelling of antiseptic and fresh linen. Cameron was stronger now. The color returned to his face, but his eyes still held the faraway look of someone who had crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. He thanked Kevin for saving his life. Kevin told him the truth. He didn't save him. Something else did. On the drive home, Kevin made a decision. He had spent 19 years recovering bodies from these caves, confronting the worst the overhead environment could do to human beings. He had seen panic, hubris, equipment failure, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of running out of gas. He had logged more than 3,000 cave dives, trained dozens of divers, and built a reputation as the man sheriffs called when hope was gone. But he had never encountered anything that defied explanation. Not until now. And the one constant in this unfolding mystery was a knot. A simple, elegant tie-off that Frank Mosley had believed could hold against anything. Pressure, time, death. Kevin pulled his truck into the garage, walked into his workshop, and picked up his spare reel. He cut off the boline he'd been using for years. Then, with steady hands, he tied a double figure eight, with the extra loop, the way Frank had taught him. Because if something was still down there helping lost divers find their way home, Kevin wanted to make sure it knew he was one of its own. Kevin didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling fan clicking, the same 4 thoughts rotating through his head like a carousel. The ghost line, the knot, the stage bottle, and Cameron Holt's voice describing a gray-haired diver who knew his name. 19 years of pulling bodies from flooded limestone, and Kevin had never once believed in ghosts. The cave was physics. Gas management, buoyancy control, silt discipline. You follow the rules, you survive. You break them, you die. That was the only law, but laws require a closed system, and what Kevin had witnessed in Twin Springs suggested the system wasn't closed at all. At dawn, he called Lisa Tran. She answered on the first ring, her voice already tense as if she'd been waiting. He told her everything. The stage bottle, Cameron alive, the description of the rescuer. Lisa listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Kevin finished, she was quiet for so long he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I'm coming down there. Don't go back in the water until I arrive." They met at the Twin Springs gate at noon. Lisa brought a full survey kit, sonar equipment, and a handheld GPS. Kevin brought 4 tanks per diver and a determination that bordered on obsession. They submerged together, following the main line past the restriction, past the terminus, into the chamber. Kevin led the way, reeling out a new survey line as he went, documenting distance and depth. When they reached the far chamber where Cameron had been found, Kevin's light swept the walls. The ghost line was gone. The nylon, the tie-offs, every trace of the passage's previous visitor had vanished. Only one thing remained, the black stage bottle still clipped to the limestone column where Kevin had last seen it, the pressure gauge reading empty. Lisa photographed it from every angle. She checked the serial number stamped into the aluminum crown, a sequence of digits that would trace its origin. Then she clipped it to her harness and they began the exit. The swim out was silent, each diver alone with their thoughts, the darkness pressing in like a held breath. On the surface, Lisa didn't waste a minute. She called the manufacturer, read the serial number, and requested a purchase history. The answer came back within 2 hours. The bottle was part of a batch sold to a dive shop in High Springs in 2017, a shop called Cave Country Dive Supply. Kevin knew the place. He'd bought gear there for years. He called the owner, a man named Jerry who had been filling tanks for the North Florida cave community since the 90s. Kevin read the serial number. Jerry remembered the sale. "That's from Frank Mosley's order," he said, his voice dropping. "Frank bought 4 of those bottles in March of 2017. Same size, same color. He had me fill them with Trimix. Said he was planning a deep push in a system he wouldn't name." Kevin's throat tightened. What happened to the bottles after Frank died? They recovered 3 of them from his truck when they found his vehicle at the entrance to Ginny Springs. The 4th one was never accounted for. "We assumed he had it with him in the cave, but his body was recovered without it. The sheriff's inventory listed 3 bottles, not 4. I figured the 4th got lost in the recovery. It happens." Kevin thanked him and hung up. Lisa was watching him. "The bottle Frank died without," she said, "found 900 feet past the end of a cave he never dived." The implications were staggering and none of them made sense. If Frank had laid that line before he died, the survey team would have discovered it during their mapping in 2018. The cave was fully mapped a year before Frank's death, and the passage didn't exist then. If someone else had laid the line, they had somehow acquired Frank's missing bottle and learned his proprietary knot. But who? The 6 divers Frank taught were all alive and accounted for. Kevin had checked. He called each one over the following week. They were scattered across the country, most not actively diving anymore. Not one of them had been to Twin Springs. Not one of them had laid line in any cave in the past 2 years. Kevin visited Frank's widow, a quiet woman named Carol who still lived in the same house outside Branford. He didn't tell her the full story, just that he'd found something that might have belonged to Frank. He showed her a photograph of the knot. She looked at it and started to cry. "He tied everything with that knot," she said. "Even the clothesline in the backyard. He said it was the only knot that never slipped." Kevin asked if anyone else could have learned it. Carol shook her head. "Frank was obsessed with keeping it close. He said a knot like that was a signature. If someone else used it, they'd be pretending to be him." That word echoed in Kevin's mind for days. Pretending. But the stage bottle was real, the line was real, and Cameron Holt was alive because of it. Someone or something had staged a rescue in an impossible location, using the tools and signature of a dead man. Kevin had spent his entire adult life recovering bodies from the dark. He had never once recovered a living diver, until now. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. Cameron Holt should not have survived. His gas was gone, his training non-existent, his location unreachable by any other diver. The survival was a statistical impossibility. A miracle if you believed in such things. Kevin didn't, but he was running out of alternatives. 2 weeks after Cameron Holt went home to Georgia, Kevin sat down with Lisa and the survey team to present the findings. He laid out the photographs, the serial number trace, the testimony of Jerry at Cave Country, and the statement from Holt's hospital record. The team was silent. These were scientists, geologists, hydrologists. They dealt in measurable data. And the data all pointed to one conclusion. A deceased diver had somehow placed equipment 900 feet into an unmapped passage that did not exist when he was alive. "We need to be careful how we report this," Lisa said, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "If this gets out, the cave diving community will tear us apart. Either we're lying or we're delusional. There is no third option." Kevin understood. The community was tight-knit, skeptical, and unforgiving of anything that smelled of superstition. Cave divers prided themselves on rational discipline. The existence of a ghost, or whatever this was, threatened the entire premise of their sport. If the caves held something beyond physics, then no amount of training could keep you safe. That night, Kevin made a decision that changed everything. He had always dived solo on recoveries. It was standard practice. A dead diver's body didn't require a buddy. It required speed and efficiency. Bringing another diver into a high-stress, low-visibility circumstance only multiplied the risk. But Twin Springs had shown him something he couldn't ignore. He had been alone in that chamber when he first found the ghost line. He had been alone when he encountered the stage bottle. And if something had gone wrong, if the line had led him into a trap instead of a rescue, no one would have known where to look. The cave keeps its secrets and it keeps its dead. Kevin walked into his workshop and opened his gear locker. He pulled out his primary reel, the one he'd used on every recovery for the past decade, and cut off the old line. Then he respooled it with fresh braided nylon and tied the anchor knot around the spool, a double figure eight, with the extra loop. He repeated the process on his backup reel and his safety reel. Every line he would ever lay from that day forward would carry Frank's knot. A month later, a diver went missing in a system called Peacock Springs. Kevin got the call. He suited up at the water's edge, the same routine as always. But this time he turned to the deputy in charge and said, "I need a second diver, someone I trust. I'm not going in alone." The deputy was surprised. Kevin had never made that request before. He called Ed Sorensen, the only cave diver in the region with more experience than Kevin. Ed came. They entered the water together, twin lights cutting through the tannic darkness. The recovery was successful. The body was located in under an hour. On the swim out, Ed noticed Kevin's tie-off knots and stopped to examine one. He turned to Kevin in the water, his eyes asking a question through the mask. Kevin nodded. Ed gave a slow, deliberate thumbs up. He understood. Some things in the cave don't need explanation. 6 months later, Kevin received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined paper, the penmanship shaky but legible. The writer identified himself as a cave diver from Tennessee who had gotten lost in a system called Rumbling Falls the previous summer. He was out of gas, hopelessly entangled in a restriction when a diver appeared out of the dark. Older man, gray hair, weathered face. The diver freed him, passed him a stage bottle, and pointed toward the exit. Before he left, the diver tied a knot around a rock. The writer drew it in the margin of the letter, a double figure eight with an extra loop. Kevin read the letter 3 times. Rumbling Falls is 500 miles from Twin Springs. Frank Mosley had never dived Tennessee. The writer had never heard of Frank, had never met Kevin, had no connection to the Florida cave community. He had simply written the letter because someone at a dive shop mentioned Kevin's name when he described the knot that saved his life. Kevin still has the letter. He keeps it in his gear bag, folded behind the logbook where he records every dive. He still does recoveries. He goes into the dark whenever the phone rings, but he never dives alone. Every line he ties is a double figure eight. And sometimes, deep in the flooded passages where no one has ever been, he feels something watching him. Not with malice, with patience. Like a teacher waiting for the student to understand the lesson that was always there. the official explanation never arrived. The Florida Speleological Society resurveyed Twin Springs 3 months after Cameron Holt's rescue. The sonar found no continuation beyond the caprock. The passage Kevin swam simply does not appear on any map and never will. The black stage bottle sits on a shelf in Kevin's workshop, serial number traced, provenance documented, a physical artifact from an impossible event. He doesn't keep it as a trophy. He keeps it as a reminder that the cave does not owe us answers. The community remains divided. A few believe Frank mostly survived his reported death and went dark, living off-grid somewhere deep in the aquifer, protecting the systems he loved. Others suspect a student he trained in secret, carrying on his work without seeking recognition. Most simply refuse to discuss it at all, because the alternative challenges everything they believe about the overhead environment. In cave diving, the line between competence and catastrophe is razor thin. The idea that something beyond physics might be watching you from the dark does not fit inside a decompression table. Kevin still answers every call that comes from a sheriff's department. He still suits up and descends into the cold, tannic darkness, following permanent guidelines to their terminus. He still recovers the lost, but something fundamental shifted in him after Twin Springs. He no longer enters the water believing he is the only living thing in the cave. And every line he ties now carries Frank's knot, a signature that says, "I belong here, I am part of this." The letter from Tennessee sits folded in his logbook. He has never tried to contact the diver who wrote it because he is not sure what questions he would ask. The man was saved by a gray-haired stranger who tied a knot that only 7 people on Earth should know. One of those 7 is dead. The other 6 accounted for. That math does not add up, and Kevin has learned to stop trying to solve it. Some equations are not meant to balance. In the deepest places on this planet, where light has never touched and pressure crushes air into a quarter of its volume, the line between the living and the dead may be thinner than we assume. Frank mostly dedicated his life to keeping divers safe. He taught gas management, trim discipline, situational awareness, and the one knot he believed would never slip. Maybe that dedication did not stop when his heart did. Maybe it just found a new medium. Water instead of air, darkness instead of light, patience instead of urgency. Kevin thinks about this on every dive now. When he reaches the end of a surveyed line, he pauses for a moment and stares into the black beyond. He is not afraid. He is waiting. Because if Frank is still out there, tying lines for lost souls, mapping passages that do not exist, staging bottles for divers who should not survive, then Kevin wants to be the one who finally follows that ghost line all the way to its source. Thanks for watching. If stories from the deep stay with you the way they stay with us, hit subscribe. We tell the ones that do not make the news. Until next time.